So I'm Lina. My talk is going to be on Egypt and Sudan, the revolutions in 2011 and 2019 respectively. To preface, this is just a brief summary of the events, and I can't include all the details. And I also don't claim to be an expert on these topics. That being said, I'm going to be walking you through 4 main moments of each revolution. So we have the anger that sparked the uprisings, the motivations that shifted to overthrow the leaders, how the regimes fell, and then finally the crossroads that each country faced afterwards. And I'd like you to pay close attention to the key players within each revolution. And if you can, place them as revolutionaries or as part of the counter-revolution, a force that opposes the revolution and leads to its reversal. And the purpose of this talk is to pull lessons from these experiences and apply them to the ongoing revolution in Bangladesh, which Sarah will talk about after me. Okay, so let's talk about Egypt. To give you context, the Egyptian people living under Mubarak's regime experienced widespread poverty, repression, and violence. Since 1981, when Mubarak came into office, he'd imposed the emergency law, which suspended legal rights for demonstrators. So it banned strikes, demonstrations, and public meetings of more than 10 people. He censored the news stations and established military courts in which there was no way to appeal. And during his regime, military and security forces were significantly expanded, and they were emboldened to regularly act with impunity, incarcerating people at will. The police force under Mubarak was well known for their arbitrary arrests and torture. The Egyptian people were also well aware of Mubarak's corruption. Many felt that they were being robbed and trapped under his rule. Millions of people were affected by his neoliberal reforms and were pushed into severe economic insecurity, with many trapped in seasonal farm labor and poor-paying jobs. Entire generations experienced mass setbacks in education across the country, as children were forced to work instead of attend school. So this harsh reality sets the stage for an increasing dissatisfaction among workers. In 2006, a successful strike by workers in a giant textile factory known as Master Spinning triggered a massive wave of strikes and walkouts across both private and public sectors in Egypt. While the textile workers' motivations were economical, their working class struggles were shared by millions across other sectors. Importantly, it was central to growing the confidence of mass movement that eventually had its finger pointed at the Mubarak regime. Over the few years leading up to 2011, protests rose all over the country for concerns on student rights, food shortages, and police brutality. Most worker strikes and demonstrations of political nature were technically illegal. So unsurprisingly, the regime's security forces responded with frivolous brutality. It was expected from a regime which regularly violated human rights. And in June 2010, the nation was outraged by the beating and killing of a young man named Khaled Saeed in an internet cafe in the hands of 2 police officers. A Facebook group in his name put out a national call for protests in January 25, 2011, on National Police Day. Keep in mind, a few days prior, the Tunisian revolution had just ousted their authoritarian president, Ben Ali. So angry and emboldened by what they witnessed in Tunisia, the Egyptian people were ready to flex their revolutionary muscles. So, overlooking the government building, sit-ins in Tahrir Square in Cairo became the epicenter of the uprising. An attempt to isolate and crush protests, the regime tried cutting off the internet and rallying state-controlled unions to support the government. But workers ignored calls to support the regime and continued striking. After an 18-day-long sitting at Tahrir Square, Mubarak was finally removed from office, not directly by the protesters, but by the military leadership, known as the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, SCAF. SCAF, which had been a critical pillar for the Mubarak regime, stepped in to take control of the country, framing themselves as protectors of the nation during this time of transition. In reality, however, SCAF leadership saw that Mubarak's position had just become untenable, and they chose to remove him from power to protect their own influence and to prevent further chaos. Though the military at the time was sort of perceived by many Egyptians as a neutral force, their intervention here marked a significant shift in the revolution's trajectory. While Mubarak's fall was a victory for the protesters, the military takeover was not necessarily what the revolutionaries had hoped for. So as SCAF used violence to dismantle the sit-ins at Tahrir Square, strikes around the country continued and even peaked following the weeks of Mubarak's fall. Workers continued to demand the removal of ruling party officials from management positions. People felt that these mini Mubaraks in every institution also needed to be overthrown. And during that time, hundreds of new independent unions emerged. While strikes continued, reformist political groups, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, worked with the military to transition towards elections. Many activists were wary of the Muslim Brotherhood's intentions, particularly their willingness to cooperate with the military during this transitional period. As a result, Morsi, a leader of the Islamic political party, was unable to rally all the pro-revolutionary voters behind his campaign. And during the elections, Morsi faced Shafiq, a former Mubarak-era official, who was seen as representing the old guard. So Shafiq's candidacy symbolized a return to the authoritarian past for many, but he still managed to attract substantial support from those who were fearing instability or just opposing Islamist rule. So this polarized the election, framing it as a choice between the Brotherhood and the continuation of Mubarak's regime. Meanwhile, during the election process, SCAF, the military, made moves to weaken civilian political power. The dissolution of parliament by the courts in the run-up to the elections cast a shadow over the political landscape. And many at the time feared that even if Morsi won, his victory would be undermined by the military's influence and control over state institutions. And unfortunately, the military would soon take hold of the country, installing the defense minister, Sisi, as the president in a coup only a year later after Morsi was elected, leading to a devastating fate for the country, with repression and violence arguably worse than during the Mubarak regime. So, bearing all this in mind, the key actors and the pressures that were faced during each phase of the Egyptian uprising, I want us to now shift our focus to Sudan and how their revolutionary crisis unfolded and the crossroads that they're currently facing. So I'm going to, again, give background to the Sudanese struggle and go through the uprising and then the crossroads. So as background, al-Bashir had held power in Sudan since seizing control in a military coup in 1989. Over the 30 years he was in office, he maintained a brutal grip on the country, solidifying his rule through violent and authoritarian means. Similar to Mubarak, al-Bashir manipulated the constitution to grant himself the ability to remain in power for life. His power was sustained by a network of military and militia forces that trapped the people and took away any political control that they have of their own country. He was in fact responsible for atrocities and genocide of non-Arab communities in Darfur, and needless to say, there was mass discontent among the Sudanese people. So in December of 2018, protests began in Sudan, partly in response to austerity measures by the government that created economic hardships, such as fuel shortages, inflation, and the people's inability to withdraw their own money from banks. These economic issues were merely the tipping point for the Sudanese people who had suffered under decades of an oppressive state power. Protests erupted in the city of Adbara and spread all over the country following weeks. The protesters' motivations quickly changed from economic concerns to calls for the regime to go. For example, 1,800 workers at Port Sudan walked out in January in 2019 in protest of efforts to privatize the port. footage of the workers using a shipping container to block the port went viral on social media, with activists then organizing anti-government protests, embracing the port workers' actions as part of the wider rebellion against the regime. The central demand for the revolutionary movement called for the establishment of complete civilian rule, free from military involvement in both politics and the economy. The Sudanese Professionals Association, also known as the SPA, quickly became a key organizer of strikes and mass demonstrations during the time. They were able to mobilize across professional sectors, including doctors, teachers, and journalists. In March of 2019, the SPA called for a general strike that put even more pressure on the regime. This mass mobilization had around 60% of participation of Sudanese workers. A major month-long sit-in outside the army headquarters in Khartoum led to the overthrow of al-Bashir by his own generals, who wanted an end to the demonstrations and the restoration of the workforce. Sounds familiar? The two groups that retained power were security forces, Transitional Military Council, led by General Al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, RCF, led by Hamadi Dagalo. So, similar to what we saw in Egypt, simply taking down the ruler was not enough to stop the uprising. The RCF used deplorable violence at the Khartoum sit-in to force people to go back to work. But after a series of strikes and mass protests, a final deal on a transitional government was signed in August of 2019. The new governmental structures, which included a sovereignty council, was meant to be a balance between military and civilian members. But the leaders of the security forces took high positions within this transitional government. Unsurprisingly, they attempted to use this new civilian facade, to disguise their rule. The military seized full power, again, in a coup in October 2021, which sparked renewed waves of mass protests and civil disobedience. Following the coup, Sudanese resistance committees, which are made up of a diverse array of individuals and groups, primarily grassroots activists and community organizers throughout the country, became the backbone of the popular struggle against military rule. They organized protests, strikes, and civil disobedience, which galvanized ordinary citizens and aimed to establish alternative governance structures. However, the challenges they're currently facing are astounding. As an open war between the two armed forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, which are sort of the official state military, and the Rapid Support Forces, RCF, erupted in April of last year, 2023. The tensions between the two military groups was sparked by a desire to control gold mines within the country and is heavily supported by international actors and corporate extraction. So this war, which is a direct result of the counter-revolution, is actively creating a devastating humanitarian crisis in Sudan. Nevertheless, resistance committees demonstrated that it is possible to combine mobilization efforts and provide a conduit for popular democracy, which can be seen as an alternative to reformist political groups. Despite the challenges, they continued to reject both military fractions while supporting their community's immediate needs during this war. So now that I've told you about the Egyptian and the Sudanese revolution, you can see that the details of the uprisings are different, but you'll notice parallels between how the Mubarak regime was toppled a few years back and then how al-Bashir was overthrown, as well as the 4 stages of the uprising that were played out in both nations. Particularly, it's important to pay attention to the key players in each of the uprising. So for example, the regime, the military, the workers, and the revolutionaries. The regime, we saw, can't solely be purged by overthrowing the leader. Neither uprising was actually able to fully purge the remnants of the old regime. And in both revolutions, the military is essentially an extension of the status quo. Their loyalties actually lie in their investment in the economy and the country's resources, and use violence and intimidation to protect them. However, the uprising in both Sudan and Egypt showcased the awe-inspiring potential for spontaneous, popular organization by workers to lead a movement in a revolutionary trajectory, and how critical they were to the cause. Other revolutionary groups, such as the resistance committees in Sudan, are doing what perhaps was missing during the Egyptian uprising, which was to bridge the gap between economic struggles and the political dynamics of the country. I will mention that Egypt did have similar neighborhood committees, which aided in the mobilization efforts during the uprising, but following the fall of Mubarak, their momentum and direction was mostly lost. There are also other groups that we can't really neatly place in the counter-revolutionary bucket, like the Muslim Brotherhood. We can argue that their dominance as a conservative reformist force hindered the development of revolutionary organization that could have effectively opposed the counter-revolution in Egypt. They demobilized the movement, centering their own goals on securing their own political power, and diverted the workers' momentum. So, I will leave you with this. Marx believed that the revolution should not stop until the working class has taken control, not just in one country, but all around the world. And as we've seen, domestic and international forces can easily derail a revolution's trajectory. And it is through global class solidarity that we can push for a permanent revolution. So, given what we've learned from Sudan and Egypt, how can we effectively tip the scale towards a permanent revolution in countries where the counter-revolutionary forces are great? Thank you. Thank you.
That was fantastic. I'm just going to get this closer. Can everyone hear me? Loud and clear? Okay. Thank you, Lina, for that extremely concise yet comprehensive overview of the revolutions in Egypt and Sudan. I'm sure that was a tough job, putting it all in a short time. But I think the way you laid out the four sort of common moments or steps in a revolution is very helpful. It's almost like an anatomy of a revolution. That there is first anger, and then there is an aim with people direct their anger towards something, and then there's that overthrow phase, and then there's the aftermath. And I really like that because I'm going to use that framework to try to understand the fantastic, unbelievable, didn't think would happen in my lifetime uprising in Bangladesh where students and masses overthrew an autocratic leader that was in power for 15 fucking years. 15 fucking years. And we're having this conversation 2 months after this uprising, a close friend of mine would like to say the situation is really fluid. Bangladesh right now is at a crossroads where debates are emerging post-uprising as they do. And but there's also an opportunity for us to have an impact on the future of this uprising and the direction of this movement, and I think that it will be helpful to look at, as Lina put it, in the case of Sudan and Egypt, the key players and the roles they play in an uprising and post-uprising, and how they're being expressed in the case of Bangladesh, so we can actually identify some of the questions around what is a counter-revolution. What would it look like in the case of Bangladesh? Where would it come from? And how do we actually stop it? So, as with any uprising, it began in Bangladesh with mass anger, discontent felt by ordinary people under Sheikh Hasina's rule. We saw the worst widening of income and wealth. There was consolidation of power to the center. So the ruling party, which was the Awami League, the ruling class, which was like the capitalist class, the parliament, law enforcement, the judiciary system, all of that became synonymous. It was all the same. And all the decisions were coming out of the executive branch, which is the prime minister's office. And the regime used incredibly repressive tools and legislations to shut down dissent and criminalize any space for organizing. And Sheikh Hasina's party, the Awami League, focused on this nation-building narrative of development. It was all about development and growth, and they undertook several international loans from the IMF, the World Bank, China's Belt and Road Initiative, and what they did is, they funded their flagship mega infrastructure projects, but what actually happened is that party-affiliated capitalist class just accumulated wealth through these projects, through backdoor infrastructure deals, financialization schemes, stealing money from the frickin' banks, and investing in Toronto, and pushing for weak labor laws that failed to protect workers. In short, it was growth for the global ruling class and not for the people of Bangladesh. So the second phase, how did this anger get aimed and where did it go? This compounded anger was widely present in the working class and the general masses, and it was being directed obviously at the government, and you could tell the credence, is that even a word? Like, I guess there were there were repeated flare-ups that was happening. The disappointment was growing because just in the last year, for example, both the tea workers and the garment workers. Garment is the biggest industrial sector in Bangladesh. Both tea workers, garment workers went on massive strikes for a national minimum wage, and things really reached a boiling point in July of this year when students in public universities started protesting against quotas, job quotas in government jobs that were basically 30% of them were reserved for veterans of the liberation war, Bangladesh's liberation war. But it was kind of an open secret amongst everybody that this quota system was used to reward people who were loyal to the party. It was kind of like a backdoor for the Awami League cadres to basically be part of the government, right? To become part of the civil bureaucracy. And so when this protest erupted, very quickly this economic demand for access to government jobs turned into the biggest political challenge for Sheikh Hasina. It resonated overwhelmingly with the masses of Bangladesh who were oppressed for 15 years under the crushing weight of neoliberalism and crony capitalism. So as we saw in Egypt and Sudan, this gave way to heightened mass activity. It drew masses of people into taking action, and their frustration spilled to the streets. It gave way, wider layers of society kept joining the struggle, and thousands and thousands of people in the last 2 weeks of July were just on the streets, in the roads. This brings me to the next phase, which is the overthrow of the government. All right, around August 1st, the dates are kind of important, okay? August 1st, the masses had actually gone. So this was a student-led protest, the quota protest, right? And they were using this banner of the anti-discrimination movement. And the video we just saw is from one of the coordinators of that movement. So on August 1st, the masses had actually gone ahead of those coordinators. They're great, but they went actually ahead of them and already started calling for the government's resignation, the prime minister's resignation and the cabinet's resignation. People started referring to the date as July 32, promising that July won't end till the government falls. And the students had to actually follow the lead of the masses and finally a call came on August 3rd, when the student movement coordinators correctly recognized the strategic role of the working class and announced what is now called, announced an indefinite non-cooperation movement. They had 15 points, and some of the very specific points in those were that garment workers will not go to factories, port workers will not handle cargo, and migrant workers, which are the second biggest export of Bangladesh, 95% of the working class in the Middle East is basically Bangladeshi migrant workers, they will not send any remittance back to Bangladesh starting the next day. This is August 3rd. When the students made this call, workers and public followed on August 4th. Basically, the non-cooperation movement lasted just a day because its potential to shut down not just Bangladesh's economy, but disrupt sections of global economy was enough to overthrow the government the following day on August 5th. Yeah. Okay, so we've done the hard part. Now the harder part starts. The Bangladesh is in its aftermath period, and we often say that's when the struggle begins. And overthrowing a government is no small feat. There are people here I can see in the room that we were there together during those days in July and those weeks in July, and I remember very clearly what that moment was like. And for the longest time, people did not believe this government would fall. And I know that when I say a lot of you will feel it in your bones, that those last few days we were living in a revolutionary situation. It was there. We felt it. All our apprehensions, things that would stop us from taking action, they were all gone. Something let loose. For Sudan, it took 4 months to bring down Bashir. In Egypt, it took 18 days to bring down Mubarak. And for Bangladesh, it took 36 days to bring down Sheikh Hasina. And during these condensed times, the process of developing political consciousness accelerates because our ideas are changed and struggle. So thousands of people in a short amount of time are arriving to the conclusion that the whole system needs an overhaul, and people have the confidence to demand more. Some examples, just consider the number of worker mobilization that happened right after the fall of Hasina, just following the uprising, mass uprising. Pharmaceutical workers, battery-run rickshaw workers, tea workers, they all launched spontaneous strikes. And garment industry workers, again, biggest industry in Bangladesh, are continuing to mobilize for a national minimum wage, as well as a right to associate with a trade union, and they're demanding their unpaid wages. Just last month, garment workers shut down almost 200 factories in key industrial areas in the country. Thank you. This clearly speaks, obviously, to the raised confidence of workers. But the question now is, what would threaten these gains to be reversed, right? This is what we want to define as a counter-revolution, right? Who will be the people trying to demobilize these workers, and why? For both Egypt and Sudan, during the aftermath of their uprisings, key pressure to reverse their revolution came from global capitalism and imperialism. The tactical approach of key actors in those revolutions may have been different, but ultimately it served the goal of preserving the interests of national and international bourgeois class. So through these stories of the three revolutions we're exploring today, we will hopefully be able to identify the key players in any uprising who are pro-revolution, anti-revolution, and those who are in the middle. Right? So they can be swayed, which can perhaps make debates around strategies and tactics clear for many of us navigating this post-uprising, this aftermath situation in regard to Bangladesh. So the first key player I want to touch on are the intellectuals. the intelligentsia, intellectuals, whatever you want to call it. So the interim government right now, led by Nobel laureate Dr. Muhammad Yunus, is made up of what you would consider the intellectuals or intelligentsia of the country. Academics, lawyers, human rights activists, nonprofit leaders, and also two of the student coordinators of the movement. They are now in the government. This was a result of the student coordinators actually rejecting very sternly military rule. As soon as the army chief had announced that prime minister fled, there will be an interim government, they did the right thing and they totally rejected military any scope of a military rule, almost kind of organically avoiding some of the fault lines of power sharing that we see in Sudan. However, the government made up of intellectuals divorced from a base of workers has their own fault lines. What often happens in this situation is that intellectuals think they have the best answers because they've gone to Harvard or whatever, and may not be accountable to the masses, right? The very masses who put them in power. And that is also when counter-revolutionary forces mobilize and get organized to try to either influence the interim government or try to set them up to fail, right? And I'm sure a lot of people are seeing some of that happen already, but I'm going to touch on just three main pressure points the interim government right now is facing from sort of these counter-revolutionary forces. The first is the civil bureaucracy and the public administration. So these are people who are often unelected, so have no accountability to the masses and can tend to be ideologically conservative. They play the role of operationalizing the state, and supposedly they're neutral, but in the case of Bangladesh, the existing civil bureaucracy, they're very loyal to the former regime. They're very loyal to Sheikh Hasina, and they're making it incredibly challenging for the interim government to advance anything. Just like the mini Mubaraks in Egypt, the civil bureaucracy is almost on a mission to sabotage the interim government by not cooperating. The second pressure is the domestic and international ruling class, which is obvious. The interim government inherited massive national debt from the Hasina government, from the previous regime, and they'll need to service them now, right? There are multiple joint energy projects with Russia, China, India. All the while, the national bourgeois class is pressuring the government to restore stability as soon as possible, especially what they mean by that is the spontaneous worker strikes. We only need to look as far as The Economist, not the publication, to see what they've been writing about Bangladesh post-uprising. These are two actual headlines, by the way. First headline, the IMF has a protest problem. Second headline, can India's garment industry benefit from Bangladesh's turmoil? Okay, I know I'm running a little over, but I promise you it's gonna be good. The third pressure point is political opportunism, and that's also really important. Both the center-right party, Bangladesh Nationalist Party (BNP), and the far-right Islamist party, Jamaat-e-Islami, which actually back in the day was affiliated with the Brotherhood a long time ago, are trying to push for an election. They're really trying to rush for an election right away. They're like, democracy equals to election, because they're trying to benefit from this uprising. They're trying to ride the high of this uprising, very much like the Muslim Brotherhood did. But none of these parties were actually central to this movement, to this uprising, which was kind of spontaneous. On the ground, the Islamist parties are mobilizing to create religious and cultural tensions, making demands on the government that it can't really fulfill. But in turn, what it does, it creates friction between the interim government and the religious masses. And when the interim government does accommodate Islamists, it gives counter-revolutionaries from the old regime a chance to delegitimize this uprising using sort of the lens of Islamophobia. The back and forth of this has meant that the Yunus administration went back on their own decisions 10 different times in the last 2 months. I will need a few more minutes. Please. For the interim government of Bangladesh, the priority right now seems to be like maintaining a balancing act, right, between the social and class interests, the conflicting social and class interests, both domestically and globally. But this very like desire for balance or radical centrism or national unity, which you'll hear a lot, can pave the way for disappointment when it's not enough to deliver on the changes, and especially when it's not enough to deliver quickly enough. And the student coordinators and I'm going to skip to that because I'm short on time. But I'll just say that the Bangladesh army actually gave this interim civilian government an ultimatum for 18 months to steer the country into a free and fair election. 18 months. But my question to the army is that who are they to give an ultimatum to a civilian government put in power through a mass uprising? Which brings me to the second key player, which is the military. Well, I will say that for what happened during the uprising is the military. Some sections of junior officers in the military, they defied orders and they expressed solidarity with the students. So that kind of helped the military position themselves as a friend of people. And the other thing is that the violence and the massacre that was happening in July, that was the worst in Bangladesh's history since its like liberation war. If the army had taken full participation in it, that would completely jeopardize their UN peacekeeping missions. And Bangladesh is the biggest supplier of UN peacekeeping mission people. they send people to the missions, but that's a really big source of like income and revenue for the army. And these were probably factors the army took into account when they asked Sheikh Hasina to step down, even though the army chief is a relative of Sheikh Hasina, they're cousins. I think like the way the army is sort of like structured in Bangladesh is a little different from Sudan and Egypt. I think especially in Egypt, where I think the military is much more intertwined in like daily life, like in the social cultural fabric of the country. And you know, Egypt had a military rule pretty much for like all the time. Broad brush. But in Bangladesh, there is a separation. There exists a prominent non-state, non-military capitalist class, like the businessmen, the industrialists, blah, blah, blah. But that class is reliant on the state apparatus, including the military, to facilitate their wealth accumulation, right? So, you know, like deep state, as the kids would call it these days. But yeah, you know, I think the tactical approach of Bangladesh army is different from that of Egypt and Sudan, because the army will be at risk of losing peacekeeping contracts if they ever take part in like a military coup. But their interests may be similar, which is to protect the status quo in the guise of stability, right? And senior officers in the army are also businessmen. They have corporate interests. They have a lot of corporate interests in Bangladesh, especially resource extraction from Chittagong Hill Tracts. And that is what we need to be vigilant about. So I'm going to actually conclude my talk by suggesting a way forward. I think that in this crossroad, the question for us that we're dealing with is whether this period will become a period of radicalization for the working class, or will the ruling class provide us with enough breadcrumbs to keep the class demobilized, right? And the lesson from the Arab Spring is that don't turn your backs on the forces that made the uprising possible. It's as easy as that. In fact, we must intensify those forces. For Bangladesh, the organizing infrastructure for was driven by students. The strategy for Bangladesh is actually quite obvious, and one that students themselves identified during the non-cooperation movement. And you know, every student movement in Bengal from 1952 to 1969 to 2024 needed workers to succeed. The strategy now is to build and protect the conditions for independent mass activity for workers. Worker struggles were the dress rehearsal for this uprising, especially the brutality with which Hasina dealt with the students. She piloted that on garment worker strikes and protests. That's where it happened first. Revolutionary students of Bangladesh who shook the dust off the establishment are now getting sucked into this bureaucratic process. They're trying to become statesmen. They're trying to operationalize and stabilize the state. But students belong on the ground. When they were mobilized, at the peak of their mobilization, they were able to negotiate with the army, with the frickin' army, and suggest this civilian interim government, right? But right now there is a situation of plural power where despite the interim government having power on paper, it's hard to say who is actually in power and in control and who will ultimately fill the power vacuum on a permanent basis. The ruling class and those who are against the revolution are right now organizing to fill that role and become the permanent power. But those of us who want to make the revolution permanent, we need to take the spirit of this mass uprising into the workplaces. Once you set workers in motion, there is no guarantee they will be satisfied by these reforms, these small breadcrumbs, because when they have a taste of what their own class can achieve, they'll be on a fire. So that's where I'll end. Thank you.